you could pursue to become like serial entrepreneur. And now you chose investors. Why did you choose investors way?
Yeah, that journalist mindset has, I think, translated into me maybe wanting to become a founder, but I just know there's so much to learn. Those early days of building a business. So yeah, I wanted to be helpful. I wanted to be a mentor. I wanted to be, obviously money helps.
Hi, Ryan. How are you?
I'm great. How are you today?
Good. Yeah, so thank you so much for your time. I'm so excited to hear your story. So please tell us about yourself. What do you do in Nashville?
Perfect. Well, thanks for having me on today. My path, professional path, has been pretty nonlinear to get to investing and into the world of startups. But I would say to you, like, what I do is mostly focused on investing right now. But the path to get there was really through a film project, a web series where my sister and I went from Alaska to Argentina in 2010. We started, we got a company called Timberland to sponsor an idea we had. And we felt like there was an emergence of entrepreneurialism. It seemed like no one was talking about. And so my sister and I, a year-long journey down the Pan America Highway where we highlighted young innovators and entrepreneurs and told their story. So these were 5-minute videos on a topic. And I think we produced like 25 different videos. So that is what actually got me into startups. We went on a university speaking tour from 2011 through 2012. Yeah, after the university speaking tour, I focused on the startup side. I met all these incredible founders. I was inspired by their story and the resilience they had and creating something out of thin air, right? Creating something from an idea. And I became fascinated by it. And so I got into crowdfunding. A company called Crowdfunder, actually, that's no longer around. It was acquired. But when equity crowdfunding became a thing, so if you think of Kickstarter or Indiegogo, I got into a company called Crowdfunder, which was, instead of donation-based crowdfunding, it was equity-based. And I really am fascinated just by the idea of democratization of access to capital and access for investors, everyday investors, to put money into things they believe in, not just tech startups, but it could be a brewery, it could be a restaurant, whatever. So anyways, now in Nashville, I'm based here. I lived in New York for 5 or 6 years, Miami for 2, LA for a couple of years as well. And then I came back to Nashville during the pandemic, actually. I think Nashville is a really great business climate, diverse economy. So a lot of the things I'm investing in typically are outside of Nashville, just because I'm not in. The last 6 years, I have been investing pretty full time and advising, consulting in a range of startups, a range of sectors. I'm in about 20, and very early stage investing. So, pre-revenue, pre-seed stage, kind of to seed stage, but also certain startups I've kind of followed on investment into Series A as well, into that round. So yeah, that's what I've been doing here for the last 6 years, like I said. It was after the sale of a company called Liquid Wi-Fi, which is a reinvention of the payphone. I was a co-founder in that company with 3 other friends, and we built a company and sold it to Verizon at the end of 2016. So that kind of was the catalyst for starting to invest.
I see. So Ryan, thank you so much. So 2 days ago, we had first call, right? And then I was so impressed. Like when you were in New York, you were like an investor, but kind of entrepreneur at the time, right? Yeah, I want to hear this story, and then maybe many audience also want to hear this story. Could you please share about it?
Yes, yeah, and this is really the genesis, the beginning of me being an entrepreneur. Like, my first first startup that I was a co-founder in is a company called Liquid, LQD, and then Wi-Fi. And if you think of what we built, so essentially New York City. And there were cities around the world that still had payphones. This was 2013, 2014, to give you a time frame. So So under Mayor Bloomberg, they put out a design challenge. And the design challenge stemmed from, hey, we have 10,000 payphones. They take up really valuable real estate, but they provide no service. They're obsolete. So they provide no service to locals and tourists, right? So what could we re-envision that would be a much more useful product for our citizens? And so the design challenge was amazing because, you had, I think, 30 companies that all responded to this challenge. And so we partnered with a really, I think, innovative company called Frog Design. They started in Berlin, and now they have they have, I think, a presence in 10 or 12 cities, something like that. But they've worked with Apple and Disney. So they're hardware, industrial kind of creators, but they're really focused user experience, user journey, the UX of a product. And so we built this almost a 3.5, 4 meter, so 13 or 14 feet, iPhone for the street, essentially. So like a digital kiosk, if you will, that put out Wi-Fi. It was real estate, so space for 5G, so small cell. Public safety cameras as well up at the top. And then you had 2 screens that were for live streaming, for advertising, because that was the model as far as creating a sustainable model where cities wouldn't have to pay or a university wouldn't have to pay. And the beauty of the project was we really wanted to create a digital community bulletin board that had showcased if there was an art crawl happening, a farmer's market, a new restaurant opening, a concert in the park, whatever. Hyper local content based on neighborhood. And so you could also make phone calls, charge your phone, but whatever. But the premise was hyper local information about what was going on around you. Yes, there would be advertising around it, but it wasn't just big brands. It would be local businesses as well that would have 30 or 40% of the screen time to share what was going on. So yeah, that design challenge turned into an RFP, which is a request for proposal. And we won the design challenge. We got second in the RFP, but it gave us the idea, to actually go after this concept, and we raised money. We raised about $4 million, I think, total, Liquid did. And then Verizon ended up coming in to buy us. It was almost impossible for us to raise venture capital money. I mean, I think so many startups, at the beginning get frustrated by the process of fundraising, right? Typically you go friends and family first, and then you try to find angel investors, whatever. But it's challenging. And that business was very capital intensive because it was hardware, and we needed to raise we needed to raise a ton of money, hundreds of millions of dollars to really scale. And venture capital wouldn't touch us because we were never going to be 100x return on their investment, right? It was more like a real estate play. So anyways, and certain people don't like advertising as well as far as investment goes. So it was a very challenging business to raise money in, but we raised some money. And then luckily Verizon came and said, hey, this is really interesting to us because we're making big investments into smart cities right now. So if you think of intelligent parking and lighting, traffic data systems, they were laying fiber all over the country, investing in 5G. So our shiny object was great to showcase to cities for them. It kind of pulled everything together. And they had acquired AOL and Yahoo during this time. So there was a big media play, right? And we were very involved in the media side as far as what we were, our device, it was a vessel for advertising and media. So yeah, so that was the company that sold to Verizon at the end of 2016.
I have a question. So
Yeah.
It was kind of design challenge. It's like a contest. 30 company
Exactly.
attended, and then your idea was so amazing, like social good, social impact, and also it's hardware, and also so hardware, so that you guys have to make kind of like
A prototype, yeah.
prototype, and you guys have to keep other inventory, and then it's like we have to have a big place to have like inventory. So it's kind of a pain, I can imagine. And then you guys could get like 4 million, amazing.
Yeah, 4 million. Yeah, US dollars. Yeah, $4 million US dollars is what we raised, which was from a family office. It was a real estate family office, and then a lot of small. I'm trying to remember. It was a lot of small checks. It was founders that like to invest in ideas. Yeah, that's who we raised from. One family office put in a decent amount of money, like over $1 million, I remember, but it was a lot of small, like 50K to $250,000 checks, right? So it wasn't, yeah, none of it was from an actual venture capital fund, from what I remember. Everything was, because I was very involved in the fundraising process, and I was very involved in like building city relationships, so we could pilot these
Yeah.
prototypes, right? Like place them in the ground and test them. So we'd have 10 to 20 in a city, right? You wouldn't just have one, you'd have lots of them, right? And they would almost create like a mesh network of like Wi-Fi, 5G, better, basically improvement of cellular connectivity close to the ground. A lot of small cell antennas are placed on billboards or rooftops of buildings, like 5 to 6 level buildings. So we were able to take 5G to the ground. Yeah. So, but you're right. This was a contest. It was like a fun, like I think they knew if they get the best ideas, there needed to be like a incentive at the end. But at the end of the day, it was, what could we build to improve cities, communication, Wi-Fi, all those things, right? Because at the time, this was 2013, 2014. So a lot of cell phone plans, AT&T, I'm saying, again, I'm only talking about U.S. carriers. So I don't know about, carrier telecom companies in other countries, but you did not have unlimited data. And if you were traveling to another country and you're not on Wi-Fi, right, you're using data and it's expensive, right? That was especially 10 to 12 years ago. So the premise was like, let's give free Wi-Fi out, right? So people can navigate a city, like flow through it without worrying about data. At least they're connected. And we're going to give them really interesting, like you could book a museum ticket. You could refill your like a Metro card on our device. There was all types of things you could do, like public transportation wise, wayfinding, book a reservation for a restaurant, whatever. So it was very practical. Real estate listings around you, like that was the idea, right? To create something that brought eyeballs, brought people together to actually use the device. And then in theory, advertising rates would go up. Like advertising just on a billboard is it's static. It doesn't improve your life, right? You're not like gaining anything from looking at something that's trying to sell you a bag or a pair of shoes, right? So advertising rates typically go up if you have more engagement, right? It's pretty simple. So that was the premise, but yes.
Okay, so I can imagine during the year, you and your co-founder kind of excited. Hey, maybe they can acquire us or can become our partner. Excited, but they are so slow. 1 year. So at that time, how did you survive? Did you have a job or we have to rent?
Great question. It's a great question. Yeah, most of our money had been used already, right? And it wasn't. We had a team, obviously, but we were all. I think every startup founder can relate to this. Like, you're paying yourself enough to maybe eat and like have rent, but no one was making money, right? It was we all had taken pay cuts from whatever we were doing before, and that's part of the journey, right? It's the type of the type of founders I look to invest in, right? Have to take that same like. They have to be resilient and persistent, and they have to figure out how to keep the lights on, right? How to keep things going. And so, yeah, the last, I don't know, however, that year that they were talking to us, we basically, I just remember all the money went toward, just continuing to improve the hardware that we had created and the software. But that's it. There was no other money for, I think the last 6 months, none of us were on salary, to be honest, or very little, maybe one or two people that were really vital to everything. We had to pay our vendors, like the people like helping us with the hardware, right? We weren't physically building it, right? We had someone that had built hardware for in New York, I think it's called the MTA, right? The Metro Transit Agency.
Correct.
We're building hardware for them, right? So the beauty of what we were doing is like we knew how to make things build for durability and efficiency and the right materials and regulations. There's a lot of things you have to look at when you're building hardware and placing them in public on city streets and all that. So, but yeah, it was very little money left, so we survived. And and I don't know, honestly, Verizon. There was one other group that was looking at acquiring us, a private equity group that was rolling up companies, but that's it. It was those two, right? It was either going to be one or the other. And luckily, Verizon came in and saw the potential of this. It was timing, right? A lot of, if we're talking about acquisitions of a startup, especially early, we were still early stage startup, right? We had been around for like 2 years, and we had gained popularity because we were hustling and we were out speaking to mayors and city leaders, and we were at tech conferences showing our prototype, right? We went to Dubai for GITEX. We went to a CES in Vegas. We went to, God, where else did we go? We were in Toronto, but we were all over the place. Mexico City. We were showcasing this thing around the world, right? I mentioned to you, we were even talking to Mitsui Fudosan, the big real estate company based in Tokyo. We were pitching them in 2017 or 2018. I was at Verizon for 2 years after the exit, right? Our team got to stay on for 2 years. Some stayed longer, but
okay. So finally, after acquired, you could like get a salary from Horizon. Horizon.
Yeah. We got. Yeah, I mean, it was a happy ending, right? We went from being a struggling startup. I mean, all startups are constantly trying to. I mean, you're constantly trying to raise money, right? You're trying to build whatever you're building. Profitability usually does not happen at the very beginning, right?
No.
I mean, whether you're bootstrapping or not, right? You're raising enough money at least to continue to build to the next phase.
Yeah.
Hire more talent. Whatever, like take whatever you're doing to the next level, and hopefully that brings in revenue as well. And that growth will translate into more funding, right? More growth, whatever. Yeah, right. It's a domino effect. But yeah, I mean, when Verizon acquired us, it was a number that it was a cash deal, and we were able to then work for them as well for 2 years, and then there's a retention bonus. Typically, there's usually like an earn out after 2. There's also milestones. Most acquisitions. There's cash or stock or whatever, and then there's milestones that they try to get you to meet too. So there's always incentives to help. If someone's going to buy you, right, they want to buy your company, they want to hopefully make money too from that investment, right? So they want you to hit milestones so whatever they've bought does well, has success. So yeah.
I have a question. So after you guys got acquisition, so joining Horizon and then working, and you could hire more talent. Thanks to Horizon's backup. And then you set up the milestone. Hey, we have to increase revenue at least till this milestone, like that.
Yeah, we looked at revenue. Yeah, you're right. So we looked at I'm trying to think of the exact milestones then, but it was cities. I think our big focus was trying to get into 10 cities in 2 years. I know the first year we went was 5 cities. I think it was 5, and then either 10 or 15, something like that. But yeah, but because the idea was too, like we wanted to have concentration of these, not just spray like 30 cities, right? But we wanted to be successful. You always want to create a perfect the system, right? Like we wanted to make sure they were used. We wanted to create the right density, the right neighborhoods within a city, right? So there was a lot of that. The first, well, even when we were a startup, we were looking at that. But once we were acquired, we actually could fulfill our promise to a city and deploy these devices and put them in the ground. We could afford it. Again, we were financing them. They weren't, right? So not only do we have to build the startup and create these devices, we then had to go put them in the cities, tear up sidewalk, build the infrastructure cost, and have somebody maintain them too. You have to clean them. You have to update the software. There's all types of costs associated with something like this, and so it's very expensive. But yeah, to answer your question, it was more like really getting it right within a city and understanding all the nuances, all the things that could go wrong, right? First, before you scale, you can't scale first, right? So you have to be smart about, that's what we focused on. 5 cities. Got 10 or 15 in the ground, and then we worked from there. But yeah, we could have never have done it without a company like Verizon or some large tech company that had also, Verizon was perfect because smart cities, focus, media, right? AOL and Yahoo and all the other things they were doing. And then infrastructure with their big investment into laying fiber all across the country and 5G. There were huge investments. So we were a tiny fraction of a fraction, right? Investment for them as far as all the other things they had going on, right? But we fit the beauty. I mean, any startup founder, like you have to, whoever you're pitching, whether it's a partnership with a big company or investor, or when it maybe comes time to an exit opportunity, you got to really figure out your story and how you fit in. You know, you're just like anything. You're selling them. You're selling them obviously some idea, something that they could make much larger and grow and whatever. But you've got to really tell the story of how you fit in to what they're building, right? And understand. And you got to understand it. You have to have really firsthand knowledge of the thing that they're trying to do. And luckily with Verizon, most companies wouldn't care about what we were doing, right? But Verizon cared because we fit this narrative that they had. So that's, I mean, it's easy for me to say, but it takes a lot of research and conversations and luck, timing, right, for it all to come together. And that's what happened. I think that's any exit. I mean, obviously, if we were a startup that was 10 years old, everyone knew about, and we had a lot of revenue, then it's easy to sell. You have private equity that wants to buy you. You have larger companies. You could go public, right? You have a lot more options. Most startups don't ever get to that phase, though. It doesn't mean they're not successful. They could have an exit. It just, it depends. Like when I'm investing, I look at all types of possibilities for success. Some of those are 10, 20, 30 times whatever I invested as far as, like a return on investment. But sometimes it's a 3x, it's a 5x. And that is success as well, right? Anything that can beat the market average of like the stock market and real estate. Like if I was to put my money in real estate or equities and Apple stock, Google stock, my goal with startups is to if I can beat that, then it's success, right? And it doesn't always have to be this 100x BS number. That's fake almost, right? If it happens, great, but that's an outlier and it almost never happens. But anyways, I just say that because it's not that easy to have that kind of outcome. Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Talk to me.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing this story. And then Ryan, you have so interesting background. First, you and your sister were journalists, like filming to local entrepreneurs. And then
Correct,
second, thanks to these like stories from local entrepreneurs, you became a founder. And like you made a company and acquired by big corporate, and you could pursue to become like serial entrepreneur. And now you chose investors. Why did you choose investors way? So please share about it.
Yeah, I love it. And I think that's a great way to kind of bring the conversation to an end. I love the mind of like a journalist. It's very similar to an investor, right? Due diligence, getting to know someone, their character, all the traits that maybe you look at when you're investing. But the journalist mindset is similar. That's all I'm saying, right? And so because I got to interview so many founders and get to know them through the Journey of Action web series that I mentioned to you, which was many years ago, 15 years ago now. It made an impression on me that I would love to become a founder someday, but B, like if I ever had success, and I still want to build, by the way, I love building. I get to build as an investor, I get to, invest in different sectors, different types of founders, different ages, right? So I'm constantly learning. Selfishly, that's what you get out of it. And hopefully, God willing, whatever, you get to hopefully get a return on investment so you can recycle that money and keep investing, right? That's all, it's success to me is mentorship, helping others out, hopefully preventing them from making the same mistakes that I did. So those are that journalist mindset has, I think, translated into me maybe wanting to become a founder, but I just know there's so much to learn those early days of building a business. So I wanted to be helpful. I wanted to be a mentor. I wanted to be, obviously money helps, but there's a lot more than money. I'm not writing $1 million checks, right? I'm writing smaller checks at the very beginning, and I'm advising typically. So I'm almost like a free employee, I guess. But I think that the beauty of investing for me is just the curiosity. I'm inquisitive. And I love understanding how to make something better, obviously disrupting something that I feel like needs to obtain it or, use it. That's what I mean by disruption, democratizing access to something.
Okay, so Ryan, now you are looking for like early stage founders, right? So what kind of a founder are you looking for?
Yeah. So I love finding founders that have failed, like they built something, but maybe it didn't work. Because that means they've got some experience, right? Like it doesn't mean I love failure, but failure teaches us, right? And so we have to learn from those failures and continue to build and grow. And I like founders that have failed before, that have been part of a company that did really well, that was like a rocket ship. And they've learned. I don't mean just somebody that was, hey, I worked at a company and it did really well. Someone that had a leadership role within a company and can like say, hey, this is like, I was there for 4 years, and this is the division that I owned and helped build. And I don't care what side of it. Maybe it could be revenue and business development partnerships. It could be, hey, I was director of engineering, whatever. But just someone that played an important role, head of customer success. I don't know, someone that played an important role at a company that grew and had success, right? Someone that maybe bootstrapped a company, meaning they had tough time raising money, attracting capital, but they were able to build something, sell it, maybe had a small exit, but someone that was told no over and over again, which most founders change course sometimes. Like mental wellness is important in health, right? Someone that is healthy, right? Just building a company and investing, it's been stressful. You're doing something sometimes that isn't easy. You're literally birthing something out of thin air, right? So anyways, that's the goal. So that's the goal with what I'm trying to invest in.
Okay, so Ryan, thank you so much for sharing the story. So lastly, tell us about your next milestone in the next 1 year.
Okay. So it's something I've been thinking about a lot personally. So I think, let's just say this time next year, I think what I've been building the last 6 years, I've been investing, right? And I've been trying to build a track record, meaning I've been trying to build a portfolio of startups across sectors that is successful, right? Showing success that I can identify and source really good deals, right? I can make an impact when I get involved. So a founder wants me on their cap table, wants me to be a part of their journey, right? So I'm a positive, investor, and I'm supportive and not a detractor. I'm not, negative. But I think the milestone is, can I build a track record of companies, continue to show that I can do that, keep investing? And I think it has to be, for me, I either start a fund with one or two other people, or I join a fund, as a partner, a fund that I really believe in and really love the type of portfolio companies that they're bringing in and backing and supporting. So I think that has to be the milestone right now. But also, I told you I've never been to Japan. So I plan to go to Japan next year, and I want to learn more about the ecosystem there and how I can be, a value add, learn about what's going on there and the opportunity, but also what founders are doing, really interesting things in that part of the world. Awesome. Great talking to you.
Yes. Okay, talk soon.
Okay. Bye-bye. Ciao.
Have a good day. Bye-bye. The 3 key takeaways from a conversation with Ryan. 1. The journalist mindset shapes an investor's perspective. Ryan shares that his background as a journalist, where he learned to ask critical questions and understand people's motivations, translated well into his investor role. This mindset helps him with due diligence, understanding founders' stories, and identifying potential in entrepreneurs. 2. The value of learning from failure. Ryan emphasizes that he looks for founders who have experienced failure because it means they have valuable lessons to share. These founders tend to be resilient and have a growth mindset, learning from past mistakes to build better business. 3. investing as a mentor and long-term builder. While Ryan enjoys building business, he found fulfillment in mentoring early-stage founders. As an investor, his role is not just about funding, but also guiding founders, helping them avoid mistakes, and contributing to their success. His goal is to build a track record of successful investments and potentially start his own fund. Okay, thank you so much for listening to our podcast today. We hope this conversation will help your future and career. バイバイ。またね。